Hi, I'm not going to make this one too long because there's space issues on my computer. Also, I, yeah, I'm quite tired. But I do want to address this because it is being debated a lot. That's the issue of Trump's Twitter account being suspended, and um, I understand his Facebook account as well, so his social media platforms. Um, I haven't checked the Facebook thing yet, so I don't know what if that's also part of it. Because Mark Zuckerberg's made a statement, so I guess his Facebook account's also been cancelled. The Democrats, of course, are trying to push for impeachment over his inciting of the trouble at Capitol Hill. My own thought on that is it's a little bit pointless at this point because in 10 days he'll be out of office, 9 days. And I know the logic that he's an unstable figure, and so long as he is in the Oval Office, he's potentially dangerous. I understand that logic, but I think it could backfire. I think it could only galvanize him into some sort of martyr, which I don't believe he is, but I don't think it should be the major priority for the Democrats. Um, However, Trump is a very unstable figure. There's no question about it in my mind. Um, Now, about the issue of him being banned from these platforms, this is not a black and white issue. It's not. Because you'll have two sides. You'll have certain people who just hate Trump, they think he's terrible, and they say, oh, this should have been done years ago. Then there's others who say it's pure censorship from left leaning media or social media people like Mark Zuckerberg. Um, I've mixed feelings about this. I've always believed that we need to be clear about what free speech is. And free speech is not and never has been about just saying whatever you want, whenever you want. Now, when someone as powerful as the President of the United States tells lies, spreads conspiracy theories, and provokes followers to do what they done the other day, um, not only is it an abuse of power, but it's it's misusing his speech, his his freedom to speak, because he's an influential figure, he's a powerful figure, and so those words have consequences. Um, I mean, this has to be understood. People talk about freedom of speech like it is absolute. It's never been absolute in any society, and it never will be, because if it was absolute, then there would be no laws whatsoever governing threats, for example. So someone could just get up and say, even if you want to make an individual basis, I hate so and so, and he or she lives at number whatever on this street, and now I request my followers to go and attack their house. You can't do that because it would be illegal. Threat. Um, the whole thing about these social media platforms being private companies, that's a bit of a dicey area because technically, yes, they're not the government. So, those who advocate the censoring of Trump would say, well, they're not the government, so they're not arbiters of upholding free speech. And yet, there's a hypocrisy there because that was their foundation principles, certainly in the case of Facebook. I think the biggest problem for me with this is not that Trump's been banned, because I do think there's a responsibility question there. And I don't think people should be able to just say what they want, especially powerful people, with no consequences. At some point, there has to be consequences, or there has to be some sort of accountability. And I read Trump being kicked off those platforms as holding him accountable for his frequent breaches of their user conduct. However, there is a problem with this. And for me, this is the biggest sticking point. And it's their inconsistency. The very same platforms, I don't know so much about Twitter, so I'll focus on Facebook. Facebook has pages that are administered by Islamist hate preachers and Islamist groups. And I know that because I've seen them when the tensions were going on with France. I could see Islamists openly calling for President Macron's death. I report them, and as other acquaintances experienced, Facebook, Facebook done absolutely nothing. So this hateful ideology is allowed to fester there with no consequences, except the odd rebuke, perhaps. The same applies to the Chinese government. The Chinese government, in all its hypocrisy, has Facebook pages, you know, of individual Chinese politicians, of their mouthpiece, CGTN. It's ironic, isn't it? Because they ban Western companies from Chinese internet space, yet they want to operate on Western companies to promote their propaganda. So they're basically saying, oh, we demand that we have a voice, but you're not allowed to have a voice on our side. Um, and how does Facebook respond? It just lets them. It just lets the Chinese government lie about what they're doing to the Uyghurs, lie through CGTN, and promote their propaganda with no consequences. Same with RT. So for me, that's a big sticking point. Yes, Trump is an unstable figure. He's a narcissist. I've no time for him. And for the record, I've got no personal sympathy with him because I think it's an abomination, quite frankly, that the President of the United States thinks that rants on social media constitute presidential behavior. I just think I've always found that incredible how Trump treats social media platforms like a weapon. So people say, "Oh, it's just free speech." I think are being very naive. Could put it this way: could Trump say, "Oh, I disagree with this country, so I'm going to nuke them tomorrow"? Of course not. I think anyone that thinks free speech is just free speech, it's an incredibly naive position to take. Words have consequences, but the biggest sticking point for me is lack of consistency. So if they were simultaneously banning the Chinese government and Islamist hate preachers and left-wing extremists for that matter, um, you know, there are certain people within Black Lives Matter and other left-wing movements that are come out with some very extreme views. So why don't they get censored? I've no sympathy for Trump, but I do have a problem with the inconsistency because I think it sends out the wrong message. And there's been talk recently of people going to alternative websites like Parler. I'm not sure about that because I think those websites are the other extreme. If big tech companies like Facebook are too censorious and too inconsistent, then I reckon something like Parler would be like the Wild West. Just anything would go. In theory, Parler, under their own logic, I don't know much about them, but my impression is they're kind of a haven for people who don't like the censorship of Facebook. Okay, what then if Antifa people decide to go to Parler just to check it out? And they come out with, because conservatives and right wing people and Trump supporters are going there thinking it's a haven for them, but then they'll have to deal with, under that logic, anything goes, people who might be far left, Islamist, and so on. And then it'll just be a free for all. So I've no problem with social media companies having rules. I just think they should be consistent. And I also think they understand the feedback. I don't like the way these big tech companies just change things without consulting people, and I don't like the lack of consistency. It's a problem. Anyway, that's my thoughts. So I just think it's naive to say, oh, free speech, so Trump can say whatever he wants. He is the president of the United States. His words have consequences. That's a no-brainer. Um, and when he abuses those words, when he pushes conspiracy theories that have little basis in fact, when he incites trouble, etc., it has consequences. But the same applies to Democratic politicians who, as an example, during last summer's unrest, basically glorified aggressive protests. And they more often than not made the caveat, oh, we don't condone rioting and looting. But there's a responsibility factor is there as well when they said that the idea of protest is to provoke. I believe it was Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez said that. So yeah, it gets into these culture wars. Both left and right need to look at themselves. But my issue is not Trump being censored. My issue is the lack of consistency and the double standards that are going on because the Chinese government and Islamist groups still get to operate. That's a problem.